Have you ever wondered why does an individual ever gets addicted to narcotics or psychoactive drugs? It's because of peer pressure, trying to experiment, and this reason might surprise most of you. It's because of overprescription of painkillers by doctors and big pharmacies around the world. And it's this habit that has costed mankind a whopping $400 billion a year annually in trying to tackle crime, manage health, and loss of productivity. And mind you, this $400 billion does not include tobacco and alcohol abuse. After all, in today's society, we all agree tobacco and alcohol are considered more of a lifestyle choice rather than an addictive, abusive habit. In our today's episode, we'll try to understand the origin of narcotics drugs, the science behind addiction, the techniques to detect them, and the impact it has on the society as a whole. Hi friends, welcome to my channel Alchemy of Thought, and I'm your host Dr. Manohar Rao. Like every episode where we try to simplify science for you, today along with Dr. Vinny from Australian National University, we'll try to understand a bit more about narcotic drugs and the impact it has on the society. If you like the content of our show, please hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, and more importantly, share it with your friends who will benefit from the content. What are these psychoactive or narcotics drugs? These are basically those chemical compounds that alter your feelings or your emotions by changing your body temperature, your blood pressure, your heartbeat, your breathing rate, your breathing pattern, and finally inducing a permanent chemical change in your brain and in your nervous system. And any of these chemicals which are sold illegally in the market are referred to as narcotics drugs. In all the ancient texts found across civilizations and across continent has always referred to the use of these psychoactive drugs by mankind either for medicinal purpose, for certain religious rituals, and occasionally as a recreational habit. Almost all these psychoactive drugs were first extracted either from plant, fungus, or mushroom that grew randomly in the wild, but the first reference of mankind actually cultivating this plant as crop occurred 6,000 years ago in the Sumerian civilization, which we know today lies in part of Iraq and Central Asia. It was here that poppy was first mass cultivated and from which opium was extracted and used as a painkiller. If you look at all the classic Greek histories, you will find a reference to a certain paste that was made from opium and used to treat the injured soldiers of the Greek war. If you look at the ancient Hindu scripture of Rig Veda and Avesti from Zoroastrianism, there is a reference to a certain intoxicating potion that was made from cannabis and certain type of mushroom that was used post a certain rituals and given to the religious followers to create a hallucinating type of effect. Cannabis or hemp that first grew mildly in the temperate and tropical climate of Southeast Asia, India, and China apparently was first cultivated for its use as fiber, textiles, and animal feed. It was only later people figured out that certain species of cannabis either was used for medicinal purpose or for hallucinating purpose. It is today that scientifically we very much know that those cannabis plant which has a higher concentration of CBD molecule actually is used as painkiller, whereas those cannabis plant which has a higher concentration of THC when consumed gives a hallucinating type of effect. Incidentally, as the cannabis is getting legalized around the world, there are these farmers who are trying to crossbreed cannabis so that you can grow them with higher CBD content so that it can be used for medicinal purpose. Whereas we also have these nefarious elements who are trying to crossbreed cannabis so that you can have higher THC content and that can be sold illegally on the black market as a recreational drug. Apparently, the naturally found cannabis has a concentration as low as 4% of THC found in them, but upon crossbreeding, you can actually increase it as high as 35% concentration of THC, which makes this type of cannabis highly potent, highly hallucinating, highly addictive, and highly dangerous. In all the references that we had in the past, mankind actually has been using these psychoactive drugs mostly for medicinal purpose, certain religious rituals, and occasionally as a recreational habit. But there has been no reference of a large scale mass addiction that happened due to the psychoactive drugs until the late 1700s, where first the East India Company and later the British started trading legally and then illegally the opium that was grown in part of Afghanistan and India with the Qing dynasty of China. They sold opium in exchange of tea, porcelain, silk, and other expensive items. And slowly over a period of time, it was the Chinese farmers who got addicted to the opium smoking, which finally forced the two opium wars between the Qing dynasty and the colonial powers of Europe in 1830s and the 1850s. Post the Opium War, when the gold rush occurred in the state of California, it was these Chinese workers who immigrated to the California along with the knowledge of opium smoking as well as the art of opium growing, thereby setting up the famous or infamous opium dens and tea houses across the California and slowly across America. It was here during the evening the pastime of opium smoking slowly gained momentum, thereby resulting in large scale addiction across Americas. Today, America is one such country which has the highest number of drug addict users across the world. As per the UNDP report of 2019, there are close to 34 million drug addict users across the world. But what is more concerning is, in the last 10 years between 2009 to 2019, there has been an increase of 30% of drug addict across the world. And this is more concerning because it not only implies there is more amount of drug consumption that is happening in the world, but also high illegal drug production that is happening around the world. Now, what begins as a simple experiment in trying to experiment with drugs such as cannabis, where people think are safe because it is natural, most of them ended up getting addicted to more potent drugs such as cocaine and heroin. In order to understand the science behind addiction and the reason behind addiction, let's listen in to a neuroscientist, Dr. Vinny Gautam from Australian National University, on what is addiction and the science behind addiction. Dr. Vinny Gautam.
Hi friends, today I will talk about the effect of psychoactive drugs on the brain, how they cause addiction, and what are their after effects. Alcohol and tobacco are one of the most common substances that cause addiction in people. Even stronger addiction is caused by drugs like heroin, cocaine, LSD, MDMA, cannabis, and meth. These drugs, or psychoactive substances, are administered in form of powder or injections. In this slide, I'm showing you a classification of these drugs based on what is their effect on our brain. So drugs like nicotine and cocaine, they fall under the category of stimulants. They increase the brain activity and makes it more alert. Depressants like alcohol and barbiturates cause a depressing effect on the brain. That is, they relax us. The third category of the drugs are hallucinogens. Drugs like marijuana, LSD, meth, or MDMA alter sense of perception and time. Finally, opioids like morphine and heroin have analgesic properties. They reduce the sensation of pain. Now, the drugs affect us in various ways. First, they affect our mental state. They cause intoxication, create hallucinations, make us high, give ecstatic feelings. Some of them are also sedatives, and some cause a state of euphoria. Now, while these mental states are what makes them addictive, they have their own side effects. In the physical state, drugs cause nausea, make people paranoid, and cause extreme anxiety. In some cases, people also get seizures, heart issues, and kidney issues. Now, when the drugs start causing physical damage to our bodies, people want to get rid of them. But then, once these drugs are in, it's hard to get out. Because at that stage, people crave for the drugs. Withdrawing from a drug causes depression, sickness, anger, agitation, and in some cases, withdrawal can also be life-threatening. Let's understand what neurotransmitters are. Neurotransmitters are small organic molecules. Here you can see a structure of the neurotransmitter called dopamine, and here for GABA. These transmitters are involved in various circuitry of the brain. Dopamine, for example, is involved in the circuits of the brain that control the feelings of motivation, reward, and memory. Serotonin is involved in the circuits corresponding to mood, well-being, and satisfaction. Endorphins exist in the circuits for pain, and neurotransmitters like glutamate, GABA, and acetylcholine are involved in circuits of the brain corresponding to fear, anxiety, attention, and memory. Specific drugs affect specific neurotransmitters or their receptors. For example, nicotine would affect the brain circuits where acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter. Circuits where dopamine is the neurotransmitter would be affected by drugs like cocaine, meth, and LSD. GABA is affected by ethanol. Norepinephrine circuits are affected by meth and cocaine. And serotonin circuits are affected by cocaine, MDMA, and LSD. As you can see, once these drugs affect the neurotransmitter circuits, they affect the corresponding emotion. Now let us take a look at some of the specific drugs and see how they affect the brain. Let's start with cocaine. When a person takes cocaine, cocaine goes and binds to these transporter proteins. This binding causes these transporter proteins to have a blocked function. And because these transporter proteins are blocked, there is excess of dopamine in the synaptic cleft, which means that there is an enhanced signal in the postsynaptic cell. Now, because dopamine is involved in the brain circuits that are involved in the process of reward and motivation, increased dopamine levels produce an increased feeling of reward. So with a repeated exposure of cocaine, the brain adapts to high levels of dopamine. The receptors on the postsynaptic cells are always saturated. So the reward pathway, the natural reward pathway, becomes less sensitive to natural processes. When a person does not take cocaine and try to withdraw from it, he or she would experience displeasure and negative moods. In fact, to experience the same level of reward and feel good, the person needs to take even more drug. Therefore, cocaine very quickly builds up an addiction. Marijuana or cannabis, or weed as it's popularly known, is slightly different. Marijuana contains a chemical called THC that is similar to some of the neurotransmitters in the brain. This particular molecule binds to the cannabinoid receptors in the presynaptic cells. Now, cannabinoid receptors are widely present in brain areas that control various functions. It's like pleasure, memory, thinking, concentration, movement, and coordination. So when marijuana is administered or taken, it binds to the cannabinoid receptors and affects all these functions at the same time. Lastly, heroin. Heroin is the class of opioids, as I previously mentioned. In the normal process, the GABA molecules control the amount of dopamine released in a reward pathway. What heroin does is it goes and binds to the opiate receptors. Once heroin binds to the opiate receptors, they turn off the signaling of GABA molecules. Less GABA molecules in the cleft imply lots of dopamine, and more dopamine means activation of reward circuit. Hence, heroin quickly becomes quite addictive as well. So friends, I hope you got a good picture of how drugs actually affect our brain, how they significantly alter the normal functioning of our brain and hence affect us and also our society.
Clearly, addiction is nothing but a biochemical reaction happening in your brain and in your nervous system. The weaning of these narcotics drugs from your body is a very long and a painful process, in fact with a high reoccurrence possibility. How does the various drug enforcement agencies detect drug around the world? There are these very simple chemical tests that are done at airports and other transit points to detect drugs such as cocaine and heroin. And for people or patients who are convicted of consumptions of drug, a simple urine test or a blood test or even a sample of hair when done undergoing a chemical analysis can help you identify the drug consumption that happens. In fact, in the last decade, there has been a huge advancement in analytical technologies such as high resolution mass spec, where not only drug that is within your body but also that is present in water bodies such as rivers and sewage water can be easily detected. For example, there was this experiment that was done in River Thames in London, where they analyzed water from the River Thames for a period of over 1 month, and upon analysis what they identified was the type of drugs that was consumed as well as the type of drug consumption pattern that was detected. It was shockingly found that cocaine was consumed daily across London, as well as during the weekends synthetic and party drugs such as MDMA spiked, clearly indicating the consumption of various drugs as well as its consumption pattern could be identified using such techniques such as high resolution mass spec. Slowly, this type of experiments were conducted across major cities in the river bodies and sewage water, allowing the various enforcement agencies to take action in identifying the drugs that was peddled in the city as well as identifying where the drug consumption peaked. How does narcotics drugs consumption impact our society? As we know, these drugs are highly addictive in nature. The moment you start consuming them, it's going to affect your health. Also, because of its cost implication, it's going to impact your wealth, because of which there's a possibility that you might lose your friends, your family, and your job. Overconsumption or overdosage of these drugs will always lead to death, and this is not the only risk that is associated with drug consumption. Most of these drugs are synthesized in different parts of the world. For example, cocaine today is synthesized in South American continents where economies and democracies both are failing. Then you have heroin that is synthesized in Afghanistan, part of Iraq and other Middle Eastern countries where terrorism peaks. And finally, you have the synthetic drugs like MDMA and other party drugs which are synthesized in the so-called Golden Crescent countries, which today is Burma, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, where local militant factions exist and democracies are threatened. But what is more important is, as the drug is consumed at different parts of the world, most of these drugs that is synthesized in different parts of the world actually are routed through African countries where dictatorship exists and local warring factions exist. So remember, it's not that when somebody consumes drug, it's his health that gets affected, but every one of those individuals living in these countries where the economies are failing, where dictatorship exists, where terrorism is peaking, every individual living in those countries are also affected. So remember a situation where next time an individual comes up to you and offers you drug, just remember to say, just say no.